you all know, this is part of the Live to Read program sponsored by the Humanities Council of Washington, D.C. It's a program that invites citizens across, and non-citizens too, anybody who lives in D.C. to read one book and then to engage in discussions about the themes and lessons we might draw from that work. And the works, there were two works this year. One was Bombingham by Anthony Grooms, and the other was The Watsons Go to Washington, 1963. Which is, as you all probably know, it's an old book, also very much tailored to kids. So we were going to focus our discussion more on Bombingham, but more specifically on the civil rights movement and how it played out here in our own community. I just want to say one thing about how this will work. I'm going to introduce our fabulous panelists. I will ask each of them a question, and then we would really like to open it up for questions. If you have a question and can make it to this microphone, that would be great. We are taping this event. We're also videotaping this event. If you would rather just speak out your question, I will be happy to repeat it for you. And we have some people far more experienced in the civil rights movement and much more steeped in the issues here in our audience. I hope they will participate. We have a lot to learn from them as well as all of you. So please feel free to join in as you wish. This group of panelists who really represent a broad and rich array of experiences in social justice, in journalism, in politics, in advocacy, who really can help understand why these events and how these events have become so fixed in our conscience and consciousness, and what we can learn and how we can improve as a nation as a result of them. First, Simeon Booker needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. He was for more than a half century the Washington bureau chief and White House correspondent for Ebony and Jet magazines. His weekly, and he did that, by the way, until 2007. And I don't, am I allowed to say what age you were when you retired? Because, you know, people be lucky to be standing up and thinking at that age, and he was still going strong. So anyway, he did that for half a century. His weekly column, Ticker Tape USA, was a must-read not only in Washington and across the country, and really brought news and events and people to the African American community in a way that no other journalism did, especially in an era when the major media outlets, mostly white media outlets, marginalized or simply ignored the experiences and lives of many African Americans. Mr. Booker blazed many trails. He became the first African American staff writer at the Washington Post. That was back in 1951, I think. He has won numerous awards, more than I can list here, but including a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard in 1950 and the National Press Club's Fourth Estate Award in 1983. Most recently, he published Shocking the Conscience, which chronicles his coverage of 10 American presidents. That's a lot of presidents to cover in the White House. He's joined today next to him by his extremely talented wife, who's also his collaborator, herself a retired attorney, Carol McCabe Booker. We're also delighted that Maurice Jackson could join us. Now, you know, his title is that he's a professor at Georgetown, but honestly, if I just said he's a professor at Georgetown, that would be such an injustice, really, because if you look at his whole life, he has done more in his life than most of all of us, I would say, in this room combined. So among the things that mark his earlier career, he has been, well, right now he's American Studies Department and an affiliated professor of music and a fellow at the Center for Social Justice. But earlier he was a community and human rights organizer, a longshoreman, and a house painter. He has written extensively about abolitionism and particularly the role of of this town and our community in slavery and the abolitionist movement. He's also written liner notes to a Grammy-nominated jazz CD by Charlie Hayden and Hank Jones. He's been a fellow at the Smithsonian and the Wilson Center. He and his wife are the proud parents of 2 wonderful children, and I think after hearing all that, we must assume that you never sleep. Welcome, Maurice Jackson. And lastly, it's a great pleasure to introduce our good friend and really a mentor in a way, David Cohen, who is to my right. David has ties to the store that really don't get any deeper than his. His late wife, Carla, founded P&P almost 30 years ago, and she had a very clear vision about this store, which was it was going to be more than a bookstore. It was going to be a gathering place. It was going to be a community forum, a place where people could come and exchange ideas, where we would provide a platform for civic discourse and a forum for exchanging information, exchanging opinions. And you know, a lot of people told her she was nuts. Would never happen. And 30 years later, almost, here we are. It's a landmark institution thanks to that vision and thanks to her dedication and commitment. I think she would be extremely proud to know that this event was taking place here today, and could think of no more important part of our history than the civil rights movement for all of us to be thinking about. And as many of you know, David has spent most of his life on the front lines of movements for social justice. He's inspired legions of activists and advocates in Washington and beyond. He was the president of Common Cause. He's been a leader on issues from government accountability to arms control to national security to building civil society to creating healthier environments for kids. His books and writings and essays are way too long for me to list here. Suffice it to say that the world is simply a far better place thanks to your being in it. Thank you. I thought we could start off today. I'm just going to ask each of our panelists one question and then one general question, and then I hope all of you will just jump right in. But my first question is to our esteemed colleague from the Fourth Estate, Mr. Booker. We live today in a digital age, and news is conveyed instantly with very little time, sometimes for reflection, sometimes in 140 characters or less if it's Twitter. But you covered the civil rights movement. You covered the Johnson and Kennedy presidencies. And I'm just wondering what you think the role of the press was in the evolution of the civil rights movement. Now, I realize you could write 10 volumes on that, but could you just give us some basic thoughts on what the role of journalism was then in the civil rights movement?
Well, it wasn't to cover civil rights. Generally, I was alone in many of the things I covered. I was amazed that the press wasn't interested in civil rights.
Presidents were not interested in civil rights.
President, the white press, the mainstream press.
Oh, the mainstream press, right?
Not interested.
So what? So who wasn't? Were you able to write about this? Were you with Jet and Ebony at the time? Were you able to write about?
I was able to, because that was about all we could write about.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the civil rights movement started in the South, and there were very few reporters from the North who would go into the South because of the dangers of blacks being in a state like Mississippi or other deep South states. It was very risky. I remember a white lady coming up to me in one of those deep South states saying, "Nigga, you don't live down here." And I said, "My God, how would she know that?" And she said, "They don't wear glasses like you have on." I said, "Oh, hell, I got to get out of here now."
Where was that?
I think it was in Mississippi,
somewhere in Mississippi.
In the deep, Alabama.
Did that change with the March on Washington? Was there more coverage of the March on Washington from the mainstream press?
Oh, no. Yeah. I don't think there was that much change. People thought there was that much change. But it didn't change down there. It changed the image in the other part of the country.
Mm-hmm.
That they had to do something about it because it was really destroying us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my people were at the bottom, and boy, all of this put them farther down.
I grew up on the West Coast, and I obviously wasn't close to the Deep South, but I remember images.
We'll have to tell you about the civil rights.
Yeah, well, no, we had a lot going on. I grew up in Berkeley, California, so we had our own thing going on there. But I do remember photographs. There were photographs that were published.
Oh, but they don't carry, photographs don't carry the real emotion.
You don't think so?
And the heat and all the other.
Well, let me just ask our other panelists. Do you all think the role the press helped or hurt, or was it Can you think of any incidents where the press might have made a difference in that day and age? Would we be have been better off if we had Twitter and Facebook back in 1963?
Well, first, thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure being in Politics and Prose. I haven't been in this profession all that long. I do work all that. Don't sleep much. I don't have much time. And so Carla and David gave me an opportunity to speak about the first book I've written. And to be on a panel with Mr. Booker, who I've read about all my life, And then, of course, we have great legends here. So, we have Julian Bond,
Welcome.
and George Ladner. I was going to get to it. I probably should have mentioned that first. George Ladner, Julian Bond.
Yep.
And Senator Graham. And it's just wonderful to be here. About the press, I had the opportunity the other day to meet Mr. Grooms, who wrote this book. I didn't know him, and I grew up in the South, so seldom do I read about the South. They say it's changed, maybe it has. I don't take my kids on vacations in the South. I just don't. It's the way I grew up. The projects of Newport News, and then being sent to Alabama to live as a kid. And I can remember the first pictures I saw. But as I read this book, I think about certain things because again, there are two things that influenced me: Vietnam and the South. And the stories he tells about one day you look up and a friend is lost. And pictures, there are certain pictures, of course. For me, it's Emmett Till. You go to the barber shop, you see the picture of Emmett Till, you see the white Jesus, but you always see Emmett Till. So when you think of Lil Wayne, his lyrics, I don't know if you all keep up with the youth, Lil Wayne. You all know about this?
Yeah.
Lil Wayne is a rapper who made some most offensive remarks related to Emmett Till. But we grew up, with that image. And then, of course, the other image is for me, is the little girls in Little Rock and the Rockwell painting, and most strikingly, it's white ladies with bonnets throwing things at them. And you understand that even when I read Bombingham, and I read about, everybody in Bombingham pretty much is middle class to me. They're so much better than what we had. It's a little grimmer than that. The poverty was just overwhelming, and people did what they could. And so the pictures, we didn't necessarily have to see the pictures, but we think about certain things, and think about certain statements. You think about, I remember living up, my grandmother lived in a little town called Grove Hill, and she was a washerwoman. And the reason she was a washerwoman was because she would not go into a white person's house and clean it, but she was a washerwoman, made $3 or $4 a week. I often say that if it's true that God created a man and woman in his own image, then he created her and threw away the mold. It was just nothing like it. And anyway, she worked and we lived up from a prison farm. And at night you could hear the men running, and you could hear the screeching and the shooting and all this. So we sort of grew up in this. It was for me almost like mass terror. So we saw the pictures, but we saw it vividly in life.
Let me just follow up with a question I was going to ask you, and it's kind of a hard question, so I apologize ahead, but it's interesting, and I think you'd be a fascinating person to comment on it. You have a rich experience with music, and you've also studied 18th century issues and history. You've written a lot about abolitionist movement and abolitionism and slavery. And I'm just wondering, when you think about the civil rights movement and your own experience that you were just describing growing up in the South, can you apply musical interpretation to it all? Are there rhythms? Are there patterns in the evolution of the movement? Are there harmonies and dissonances? Are there things almost musically that mark a movement like the civil rights movement?
Well, I think so. I think Dvorak and others spoke about it. The music, the Negro spirits is we often say the jazz is the most original music of that, but it's not quite true. It would have to come from the Negro spirits, the blues, to jazz. But if you listen to the rhythms, the call and responses, the African, the polyrhythms, in African polyrhythms, you go in circles. It's not linear like Western music where you go from. And so you hear that repeating the refrains. And when you hear Bernice Reagan and people singing, but they took these songs. Understand that the Negro spirits were very important. But at a certain point in life, it happens. It happens all the time. At certain points in the early 20s, many blacks wanted to get away from those rhythms. And they weren't to, you had to debate about the way people speak in a Southern culture, and of course people like Sterling Brown and others brought it back. But those rhythms came now. In the civil rights movement, they brought these songs back. Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel? Didn't No More Auction Block for Me? No More Pine of Salt for Me? And all of these things. And so what we found is that there was a great similarity in jazz, and that's why the guys I worked with, Charlie Hayden and the great Hank Jones, started putting together these rhythms. So it's very much. But I would say this: that the rhythms of African American music are probably the most poignant and the most known throughout the world. You go anywhere, And I'm working on something with the widow of Ahmed Erdogan, and about that. He had sort of discovered, well, he didn't discover it, but he put it back together, and people had ignored it. So I think that we come to that, and when you look at Michael Jackson or James Brown, probably the two people who've influenced African American or American culture probably more than anyone in this century. You look at those rhythms, how they come back, and you think of the words of James Brown, "Say it loud, I'm black and proud." Think of the words of Michael Jackson, "Man in the Middle." And my kids were little, and they came, "Dad, listen to this song." And what was the song? It was Free Willy. And I didn't. My wife took them to the movies. I was in graduate school, and they came home and said, "Dad, listen." And I said, "Listen." And what did the song say? And Willy's doing what? Rivers crossing the river of Jordan. So you see that, and they're freeing the whale as they free the people crossing the river. So songs and rhythms have a great influence in our life.
So interesting. That's an incredibly fascinating way of looking at it, which I so appreciate your helping us with. And just turning to you, David Cohen, you were married to probably the best, most read person on the face of the planet. And I know from being around you that you also are a great lover of books, obviously, and a prolific reader. And I know you read a lot of nonfiction, but I also know you read a lot of fiction. And I'm just wondering, you've also obviously experienced and been a leader of different kinds of social movements and advocacy work. What can we learn? And how many of you, by the way, have read Bombingham? No, not so many. Okay. It's really worth reading, by the way. But he really combines two stories: a story of his of this protagonist's experience in Vietnam, and then flashes back to growing up in Birmingham and his childhood experiences and a mother who's dying. And there are a lot of multi messages, I would say, going on. But I guess the question really is, what can we learn from fiction about this period and about the civil rights movement that we can't learn from history, politics, journalism, or that we might just know from kind of the ether?
Well, I think we can learn lots from fiction. And I think what the role of fiction now is that it is a way of helping people who did not live through the period understand it. People who are history in America don't exactly go together easily. We have a lot of historic amnesia, and that's why the history books that get written are really quite important, and quite an important record of capturing things. But one of the things that I'm struck by is how children's novels can really make a difference. For example, there's a new novel now by a woman named Lila Guerrero Weaver, which deals with, she's an Argentinian who's come to America, and she is tying the immigration experience to really what went on in the 60s in Alabama and Mississippi. And this is a wonderful way of connecting. There's a woman named Kristen Levine, and it's a graphic novel. And so there's a place for graphic novels and I have to say, Carla introduced me to some graphic novels that I wouldn't have otherwise read, and Beyond Mouse, and that was important. Kristen Levine has written, this is a recent novel called The Limits of Little Rock, and it is about two children, one African American, one white. The African American can pass, and it deals with those kinds of tensions, and that's a very, very valuable kind of thing. There are obviously older novels that are part of our canon that many of us I know have read. Certainly Invisible Man, and novels that deal. There's a writer who you probably can only get on Libris these days, by the name of Borden Deal, who wrote about the tensions between white working class and African American working class, and how, as we know, racist political people were always trying to divide that world. and those novels capture the working stuff. So I think that's really important. And I want to comment on the journalism part too, if I may, Lissa. First of all, I want to say I think it's terrific that this event is occurring, and I think, you know, Lacey and Dunham and you and Brad have, it's really important to carry on, and you defined the story beautifully, and I think the additional education programs are wonderful. So that's really fantastic. And I think we, because it's a place of public discussion, one has to really recognize that people like Simeon Booker and Geraldine Fitzgerald, or Geraldine Brooks, I think, who was a great reporter for the Chicago Defender, these were pioneers. They were out there all alone. There were marches that came to Washington in after Brown versus Board of Education that just got treated in an episodic way. But in time, there was very rich coverage by the mainstream press. And I think of reporters like people like Gene Roberts, who really directed this sort of stuff, and John Popham and Claude Sitton and John Herbers and others who were out there. What they were terrific on the events, and David Halberstam has written a wonderful book called The Children, and he became one of those who tried to dig a little deeper. But what was missed by the day-to-day journalists, and maybe there's nothing you can do about this, but they missed the people who were underneath making the movement work. And so it runs deeper than Dr. King and John Lewis, and John Lewis writes a lot about this in Walking with the Wind, and of people like Dorothy Cotton and Daisy Bates and Diane Nash, who were really the organizers and were really making things happen. And it reminds me of, there's a new book out by Paul Kennedy, I forget its name, he's a very good historian, but it's the people who helped bring about victory in World War II, and it's not the generals, it's a lot of other people. Well, the journalists were not able to recognize the kind of people who were underneath the movement and who were really making a difference. And that's, again, where we need the historic memory, and some of that kind of thing comes out in the novels, because you're then dealing with the builders, the doers, the organizers.
I want to circle back to one of the points you made, but Maurice Jackson, you read the book. If you look at his copy, it's dog-eared. It's got all sorts of little sticky things where he's obviously, there were things that struck you. What do you think the book Bombingham adds to our overall understanding of the civil rights movement that we wouldn't already know?
Well, many things strike me as very personal. Vietnam, you know, he talks about Vietnam and guys coming home in body bags. I can remember as a kid playing basketball with guys, and then they go up to war, and then they come back, and the bodies would be in black bags at Dover, Delaware. And I think if we saw black bags coming to Dover, Delaware, and saw them like we did when I was a kid, we may have a different attitude about this war. And even if we had an attitude about this war, maybe we would do something. But what strikes me are the things that just remind me of the South. For example, I had an uncle. He never talked about the war. He come to find out, he had driven for Eisenhower. He turned white overnight. He had been in Normandy, and he had been at the Battle of the Elbe. And so, what a remarkable experience. I think of little things growing as kids. We eat at home, and I always grew up eating with my hands. I like eating with my hands. It's improper at certain places, but chicken and things like that. But people just eating the way they want. Church. Dr. King says 11 o'clock Sunday morning is the most, thank God it's integrated right here today, but it says the most segregated of time. Looking at that and how people put on their Sunday best, and and thinking about the meetings. You know, you see people go to mass meetings now, and people go almost looking like anything. We think in those days people really put on their best. They were proud of what they, and so you know, the pride, and then the fear. Here's a man who was going to war, but he's so fearful of his kids, fearful that something would happen to us, and decisions you have to make. And people made those decisions. So it's not just a glorification; it's looking at the lives, and then most importantly, then I think of today, and we look at Washington D.C. and it comes back. We have the March on Washington, and just that, you know, so many people in the city are doing so well, but so many are just unemployment anacosted 27%. High income rate for whites, high income 537,000. Bottom for blacks 9,000. A white family of four make $100,000 a year. Black family 39. Now the average white family makes way more than $100,000. Average black family may not make. But the poverty that exists right here in this city, and nobody's doing anything about it. So I look, and those things just just strike me. And I should say that, you know, it does have another personal level, and I think anybody grew up in it. One reason I went to study the 18th century was because I had to get away. I just had to get away, and I wanted to find out why we didn't solve the problems. And I still am trying to figure out why we haven't solved the problems in this rich nation that they could really be solved overnight.
Yeah, thank you. I think I could really highly recommend the book. It is really a book on several levels. It's really seeing the civil rights movement, at least for me, through the experience of a family. It was a middle class African American family, and so you see the way the events unfolded from the perspective inside that family that's already undergoing pressures of its own. Then it has the overlay of this collective struggle that was being played out in Birmingham at the time, and then of course a larger, longer national struggle that was played out through the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. So those two things are juxtaposed, and it really does, I think, capture the emotion of that particular family and the protagonist quite well. But moving on, and circling back to something that I think all of you will have something to say about, you've all witnessed or participated in popular movements. And we have seen in our own lifetimes the power of popular movements to affect change, almost always for the better, I would say. We saw the impact of the March on Washington, which was on television. I was a kid at the time, but I remember being riveted by that. And David, you kind of alluded to this. You know, we all know that it takes a collective conscience and collective energy to have a popular movement, and it also takes a leader. Fortunately for the civil rights movement, Dr. King and Julian Bond and others were there leading the charges. But as you said, there are lots of other elements that are necessary. And I'm just wondering, Mr. Booker, first, if you said the press didn't really play much of a role, what were the most important ingredients of the civil rights movement? What are the essential elements to a popular movement like that to succeed?
Well, really, I wasn't involved in the popularity of it. I was way down there at the start of it, where I was going to Mississippi. I had to carry a Bible on the car. I had to be careful of where I went. I couldn't talk to many people. I had to sneak around in and out. I couldn't eat regular. I had to work between friends who would guide you in and pray I would get back out, and hoping the photographer was able to get pictures without somebody snatching his camera and running us out of town. It was a very difficult job to get the basic thing to start any kind of revolution or get people to think, because they didn't know what was happening. And you had to have people go down there and penetrate to get the first stories out. And once you got it going and you developed a sort of a base, you could operate. But when you didn't have a base, you were in real trouble. And that's where I spend most of my time in Mississippi, opening it up. Because I was from Cleveland, Youngstown High, and I didn't know the South. I'd never been to Deep South. I was shocked to see conditions as they were.
May I add to that?
Please.
You had two elements here in terms of bringing the civil rights movement to the forefront and to the national attention. I think one of them was certainly going on. Shocking events. Even before the murder of 14-year-old boy, not young man, boy, Emmett Till, a beautiful boy, you had the murder in broad daylight of Reverend George Lee, 1 year after Brown versus Board of Education. And Simeon was shocked, as he writes in his book, that no Northern press covered that, the first civil rights murder since Brown. And he vowed not only to cover that, and that was the first picture probably of a body in a casket in Jet magazine, but it was not as horrendous as young Emmett's. The Reverend Lee's jaw had been shot off. And there it is in Jet magazine. Simeon is down there for the funeral and is warned with his photographer, you better get out of town because the sheriff's done spotted you. And they have to circuitously find their way out of town down in Belzoni, which is well known at the time as a place where you better damn well know your place or you're going to get it. So the murders continue, and a few weeks later, young Emmett Till is reported missing in a little blurb on AP in Chicago, where Simeon was based at the time. He goes over to see Mamie Till, and he gets pictures of this child and his mother. And he puts them in Jet, and he vows he's going to cover this case and find out what happened. And very quickly, the body is discovered in the Tallahatchie River. Well, all well and good. Shocking, yes. But how do you awaken America to the fact that this is going on? And this is the role of the press, because there's no reason for him to be in the South. He's based in Chicago. The Southern press is the black press down there. They're covering things. Some are a little more liberal than others. Some are neo-segregationists. You have the Jackson Advocate. You have the Memphis Tri-State Defender. They're at different ends of the spectrum. We had this first real national black publication that says, we're going to go down there. And he's scared to death going down there because he's never been there before in his life. And he's trying to blend in. And this woman looks at him and says, our niggers don't wear glasses like that. Well, yeah, he wore thick glasses. And if they did anything to them, he'd be out of business. And he's traveling with a photographer. As you mentioned earlier, the role of pictures. And Simeon didn't mean to downgrade the role of photography in all of this, because he always traveled with a very brave photographer. And he gives credit to those photographers like tall, skinny David Jackson and short Maurice Sorrell, whose wife lives right in the neighborhood here, his widow, and Mornita Sleet, the Pulitzer Prize winner. And he gives them credit because they couldn't hide. When you're carrying a camera, particularly back then, now you and I can sit here like this, and we're taking pictures of everybody in this room. But back then, you couldn't do that. You couldn't even do that with a cell phone. You had to have what they called a 4x5, and there was no place to hide that doggone thing. So if you were going to do your job, your life was in danger. And Simeon will tell you, quite frankly, he stayed away from them. He never stood side by side with his photographer and said, hey, let's do this, let's do that. Because then the two of them would be in danger. So you stay here and I'll go over there, and you do your best to stay alive, goddammit, because we need your picture, because Jen and Ebony were picture magazines. That was it. They went side by side. And he'd be back over there, and then if he got caught, you got the picture and you got it back to Chicago. So I think those two things went side by side, the photographers, and once you saw these shocking events, and they were shocking, how did you shock the conscience of the nation, and more importantly, shock and embarrass the White House. And thank God when Kennedy came in and was dealing with Khrushchev, he and his brother Bobby Kennedy would tell Simeon and their publisher and his publisher, this is embarrassing. This is embarrassing. Reverend Abernathy spoke up and said, I've been embarrassed all my life. And from there on, I think that's what brought the white press in, was the black press opening it up. And yeah, there were very many, like Jack Nelson and the others that you mentioned, and
Hottie Carter.
and Gene Klibanoff, who collaborated with Gene Roberts on
The race speed.
on the race speed, yeah, and on covering these events. But as you said, they covered the main events. And there was this tiny, if I may, one more thing.
Absolutely.
There was a tiny column that Simeon wrote for about 53, 55 years called Ticker Tape. And Mr. Bond is smiling, and Joyce Ladner is smiling, and other people here who ever read Jet magazine back then know. You look to Ticker Tape to find out who was doing what, to whom, by whom, and what the effect was, and what were we not being told. So Ticker Tape USA was the Twitter. It was the latter-day Telegraph that told people what was going on in the black community that wasn't in the newspaper or the magazine right then, might later on. You keep an eye on Pat Harris. You keep an eye on this young fellow out in Cleveland who might, he's rising up the ranks, Louis Stokes and his brother. And you keep an eye on people like Dellums and other people that we never heard of. And you're in California, we would hear about folks out there, and you'd hear about folks on the East Coast in that two-page column.
Funny you mentioned Ron Dellums, because I grew up in Berkeley. He was actually on the Berkeley City Council. And that seat that he eventually, he won. He won the congressional seat. At that time, it was the 7th Congressional District of California. And it was interesting because it was occupied through the early part of the civil rights movement by a very liberal white congressman who was extremely good. And then Bob Scheer of the Peace and Freedom Party, who I'm sure David knows and remembers, ran against this congressman and lost. And then an African-American attorney, very eloquent and wonderful man, ran and lost. And then Ron Dellums ran and won. And then he, of course, was in that seat for many, many years. But I remember him from when he was on the city council in Berkeley. So, it's interesting. I'm so glad that you've given us these stories and reminded us that sort of filled in the blanks about the media, because there were these small pockets of white journalistic activity where white reporters would go to the South and have their own consciousnesses and consciences opened, I think. Hottie Carter's paper in the Delta in Mississippi was one of the first to, it's interesting, in 1947 it won the Pulitzer Prize, not for advocating an integrated municipal swimming pool, but for advocating at least a swimming pool for the black community in that part of the Mississippi Delta, and his house and car were firebombed constantly. But that became a little oasis in the Delta for that kind of journalism. But the role of the black press and the black publications obviously was so instrumental, and it's so important to have that part of the history. Please add on and tell us what you also think, other elements that you think would be important.
Just one thing, going back to the book, and if people have a chance to see the book, because they're paper boys. Yes. And they're throwing the papers every day, and they don't know what's happening. The father says, read the paper. Right. And if they read the paper, of course, there's nothing there, but they can read the white viewpoint. This is what these black people are doing. But the other aspect of the media that comes out in the book is the absolute fear that the foreign press will also see this. And then the role of children. And so he suddenly winds all this in. The children's campaigns haven't really started, hadn't hit this is the beginning of it. So he suddenly is able to use all these different, and so again that goes back to historical. But we have people in the audience who were there, so Mr. Bond.
Yeah, why don't we open it up? What were the elements that were necessary? We've heard the role press, we've heard the role of these lower level leaders and organizers of the grassroots, and you all should comment, and then please let's open it up, and if you have questions or comments, if you can come to the microphone, great, and if not, we'll be happy to
Can I make a couple of quick comments? I think one of the important things is the pushing that takes place by movements. So the ability to organize and being able to create in spite of all the risks, a relatively safe atmosphere of community in organizing is really absolutely critical. And that's why I mentioned the Dorothy Cottons and the Diane Nashes and the Daisy Bates. They did that. And they had to push the administrations. And the Kennedy administration needed a lot of pushing. The Kennedy administration didn't even begin to wake up, and then it hardly woke up when Bull Connor and Birmingham happened. They had to be pushed all the time. And that was true of Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy. And you can argue that they, in 8 months, did more than Eisenhower did in 8 years, and that's probably correct. But the gap of what had to be done was enormous. And so there were those of us who had to be pushers. And one of the political differences is that there were then Republicans who actually believed in civil rights. And they were a very valuable part of the effort. That's not true today, and that's one of the damaging changes that has occurred. The other thing that I think is important is to recognize that there could be a lot of creativity in the grassroots, and the grassroots could be creative about a lot of things, but they were also creative about lobbying. And one of the things that is an untold story in the enactment of the '64 Civil Rights Act, and I was a lucky guy because I got to brief these people, is that people came up from the South who are African American and white. And together they came from Georgia or Alabama or North Carolina or South Carolina, knowing that they could not lobby their senator. And they said, we're going to adopt a senator. And they played an enormous role in influencing the Republicans who were not persuaded yet to be positive on civil rights. Fantastic role. And they did this coming up, and the people had a dress code then, and everybody came in a shirt and tie and a dress or a suit, and women wore a suit or a dress, and they presented themselves to these senators and their offices, and there is no question that played a significant role, and it's not been well reported, and it hasn't been well reported even in the history books. So I think those are all parts of a movement that make a difference.
These are all such fascinating comments. Let's open up, ma'am. You have a question, and we would like to get to our real experts who are sitting in the audience at some point. If you could join in with your comments, that would be great. But please.
I was attracted to this talk because of the title about civil rights in Washington, D.C. And for those of you who've studied the 19th century, a lot of the basic fights were fought here first and actually won during Reconstruction. However, and even though so many of our leaders in our first Home Rule City Council were all graduates from SNCC and were all involved all over the South in the events you're talking about, we're still left out. And we still have no real civil liberty, civil rights, because we have no right to self-government. How does our nation's capital always become the part that's forgotten? We talk, everything happens here. You think about Martin Luther King and the March on Washington, but you don't know about Martin Luther King coming here to march with Washingtonians to get rights for the District of Columbia and to lobby Congress and to lobby LBJ to try to get us some kind of local rule. But we should deserve the same rights as everybody else. How do we get that covered, and how do we get people not to forget that despite Eleanor Holmes Norton and Marion Barry and John Wilson and all the folks who were all over the South working for everybody's rights in this country, that nobody seems to be working for the rights of people.
What a fantastic question. Would anybody like to, Maurice or David or Simeon?
Well, you know, if you look back, you know, there were all type laws, and we know that starting in the you know, the black codes, which when blacks got freedom, you know, because Washington had a large number of African Americans who were free, and when they moved forward, black codes came in, which says more than three. But one of the keys to modern Washington came when Mary Church Terrell, and you have to be careful because I'm Mary Church Terrell, but it's Mary Church Terrell, she would say, and others, amongst those, Joe Raw and others. And this was in the day when African Americans and Jewish people worked together on particular issues. But when they found what they called the lost laws, and these were laws that had been passed in Reconstruction, which prohibited discrimination in public utilities. But when they overthrew Reconstruction, they overthrew all these laws, but they forgot to overthrow these two laws. And so Rao and Mrs. Now you understand Mrs. Church Terrell. I mean, she's probably in the 80s, and she's there with this big, beautiful hat and the white gloves, marching slowly. And with this, they helped bring about the first public accommodation laws in the country, mainly the Thompson restaurant case, which allowed people to go there. So this was long before Brown versus Board of Education. So these laws came in. Now Washington D.C. It's a different question. I could speak forever on that. But I will say this. You know, and Mr. Bond made though this just looking at that it was Kennedy made a speech up at American University in 1963, and as he made this speech, remember what else happened in '63? He makes this speech, and then he goes to Congress. They pass the first law. Medgar Evers is killed, and of course later the young girls in Birmingham. So all of this had a tremendous impact within our.
Well, Julian Bond's going to the mic. I'm going to comment, and you've got to recognize that there is Washington and there's the District of Columbia, and the two were often not in sync. And one of the things that the civil rights movement did was it allowed tremendous leadership to emerge locally that didn't otherwise exist. Some of these were veterans of the civil rights movement in the South, but they all weren't that. And that was an important part. And it's a constant effort to get D.C. and Washington, District of Columbia and Washington, to work in sync so that there is representation, voting representation, and yeah, and that's an ongoing effort.
Welcome.
Thank you for doing this. This is a great program, and I'm drawn to it because I was not living in Washington in the heyday of the civil rights movement, and was drawn to this panel because the title you said to it, and always good to see Mr. Booker. But there's so much been said that I wanted to comment about, and I'm not sure if I can. You all should know Charlene Krantz over here, who was a soldier in the early days of the student movement in D.C. And she continues on, you know. She and Joyce Lavin and myself and other people are part of the SNCC Legacy Project, trying to preserve the history of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that's important to Washingtonians because in our very first days, we complained about the lack of political representation people in the District of Columbia had. And I think that was due to the presence of people like Marion Barry in our ranks. But my wife, who's an attorney sitting with me, mentioned something I think was an oversight among this panel. No one mentioned the judges. Nobody said anything about the judges. And some of those judges were just magnificent people and ruled on things that other judges would not have done so. Think about Frank Johnson in Alabama, particularly, who was the youngest federal judge ever named when he became a federal judge, and who at one time controlled the state of Alabama's education system, political prison system. Almost every public institution in the state of Alabama was controlled in a benign way by this man because he wrote the rulings that struck down segregation in these places. So it's and the lawyers as well. There was no mention of the lawyers who played a magnificent role in this fight. both here in the District of Columbia, like Joe Rao, and others elsewhere. And I'm sure there's more I could say, but I won't promise it.
Julian Bond triggered it in me because Frank Johnson was one of the great judges, as Julian said. He was also appointed head of the FBI by President Carter. And sadly, Frank Johnson got ill, seriously ill, and could not take that job. The FBI would have been a very different institution under Frank Johnson. It was probably Carter's greatest appointment. And I remember at the time I was president of Common Cause, and we hailed that appointment as sort of the coming of the Messiah. And it's one of those just sad stories of history that couldn't have happened. But Johnson was a courageous judge whose life was often threatened as a result of his decision. So I thank you for bringing up the memory of Frank Johnson.
They're pleased to be here today, especially to see Simeon Booker, who has written a wonderful book about a place that I called home, Mississippi. I can recall that Justice Frank Johnston was a great judge, federal judge. I also had the privileged opportunity. I appeared before Judge Cox in Mississippi, who called us niggas from the bench, and he was a federal judge. So that means that that is all the more reason we should celebrate a person like Johnston. The picture of Emmett Till's mangled, swollen, destroyed body that appeared on the cover of Jet magazine really galvanized a generation of young people. And someplace I wrote that ours was the Emmett Till generation. We were the post-war children whose fathers had gone off to World War I, and I had a great uncle, Archie, who went to France in World War II rather. Our fathers did, and Uncle Archie went off to France in World War I, came back and told us kids that we had an obligation to change things. Because even in France, he had been asked by some French women to see his tail, his monkey tail. So I cannot, I have no words to, I guess what I really want to know from Simeon is, there's a photograph of you and the other black press and Congressman Charlie Diggs, who was just a wonderful person on civil rights, time even before he got elected. You're sitting at a little table in the small Tallahatchie County courthouse, and all of the black people who constitute the media and city white media, they're there, sitting at this table, and all of you are looking like you're a little scared. With these good old boys sitting around, in open collar shirts, and I think it must have taken less than an hour for them to find the defendants not guilty. What were you thinking at the time? That's what I wondered. Because I was a 12-year-old, 11-year-old rather, in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and the only real news we got about the Emmett Till case was from, as we called it, the Jet magazine. That was slipped into the state. I remember one of my neighbor's brothers worked on the Illinois Central Railroad, and on that City of New Orleans train going from Chicago to New Orleans, City of New Orleans train, he used to throw off to us kids the Jet, the Chicago Defender, and we got Ebony magazine from one of my mentors, Dr. McLeod, who was a real race man. But we got no news, except once a day there was Chet Huntley and David Brinkley, and if they could have censored that from the local NBC station, they would have. All of our news about the Emmett Till case, my sister and I, my name is Joyce Nathan, my sister and I kept a scrapbook about that case. It came from the Hattiesburg American. That was just absolutely awful, but you provided us the glimpse into what was really going on, and I want to thank you for it, because it really helped to mobilize me and so many others to change things. That picture, that one picture that your photographer took, made us feel that we had an obligation as his peers to really see that democracy could come about. So that's all.
The picture you're talking about they wouldn't let us in the courtroom. So we went to the judge, and finally they put us in the back of that courtroom and got a card table. And then Congressman Diggs showed up. They wouldn't let him in. They didn't know we had a black congressman. So they put him at that table. And that was a real terrible experience. But you had to go through it because I wanted to see what they were going to do with the evidence they had on tape. With nothing. But it really opened my eyes to justice in the Deep South. Now, have I said enough?
Well, why don't you tell us about your coverage of the March on Washington?
Yes.
Just tell us about your experiences here.
Well, I was a realist in those days, going out covering firsthand just to see people marching way up in Washington didn't turn me on that much. But I did cover the march, and they had a lot of people who showed up and marched. But what I couldn't get in my head was, how was that going to affect people in Mississippi? You had to do more than that. And so I never believed in a lot of marches and exhibits and that sort of thing. I was a man of action, get out and open it up, write about it, let people know what was going on down there. And that's what I tried to do. And it was very difficult. And I went many days without eating quality food, no sleep, traveling by night. Oh, it was terrible. But I went through it.
I have a couple of comments.
Comments.
Well, I think one of the things for many of us, and I grew up in a small town called Bombingham, Louisiana, and I remember I was 17, 18, when the March on Washington happened. And I think that one of the things that the March on Washington did, as that many marches did throughout the South, was they became a reinforcement for those of us who were in these small towns, who were struggling. And particularly, I think when we look at the movement and understand the movement, that there were major differences if you were in a place like Birmingham as opposed to in a place like Bombingham, Louisiana. I mean, major cities and small towns and communities were totally different in terms of how you struggle with this movement. And so one of the things that the marches did for everybody is that they reinforce you. Just like I think that one of the things that the music did during the Civil Rights Movement, when you were marching and you were singing these songs, is that the music shielded for us those nasty things that they were yelling at us. We didn't always hear them because we were singing, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round." So you couldn't hear them calling you nigger. You couldn't hear them, saying all the nigger lovers to the white people. You couldn't hear those things, and so it gave you courage to continue to march. I think people had different experiences in the march. I think that I remember with Emmett Till, we heard that he had been killed, and he was a black boy out of Chicago, a young black boy, and that I can remember very vividly. My mother was crying, and they were on the phone, and black women were just crying, and I think for them, my mother was saying that it shows you that even black children weren't safe in the South, and something had to be done. I think with King, by that time, his popularity had grown, and I can remember wanting to go to the March on Washington, and we didn't go. But I can remember in my town that all the speeches were happening, but everybody kept saying, "Oh, he's going to speak. I know he's going to speak. He's coming." There were a lot of people waiting to hear King. which is, I think, is totally different for those of us, and people in SNCC and in CORE who were involved in this march every day and in this thing. Because, of course, there was certainly, SNCC had a different opinion of King than a lot of other people in terms of the role that he would play and what he wouldn't do, as did CORE. And we had CORE in Bogalusa more than we had SNCC. And then we had the deacons. But I think there are just a lot of interesting pieces, like Maurice's experience growing up. It's totally different from my experience in growing up in a small southern town. It's absolutely totally different. And that young people, I think, were young black kids were a major force during this movement at some point. My brothers and sisters were ready. They had made up their mind that if the older people didn't do it, they would do it. They started the first march. And that happened in many places, that young people just decided that they had had enough. And that maybe it was television, maybe it was for whatever. But they were not going to wait any longer. And then so with SNCC and CORE and people coming in, that was what they needed.
And how did you get, were you standing by the train getting copies of Jet thrown out? Obviously you know, but you're talking about the march being such an inspiration for people who were living in areas that were more remote and obviously more removed from the.
Well, Bogalusa was probably a very interesting town because it was an industrial, one of the few industrial towns that had a paper mill and a box factory there, so blacks were independent to a degree. But also that Bogalusa was the second place that the Deacons for Defense and Justice was found. But we got mail. We could order, we could get Jet and Ebony. We had the Louisiana Weekly, you know, so and of course Southern was not too far away and those sort of things. But I think while we were somewhat segregated, we knew that there were things that we did not want to continue the way we didn't want to continue to live. And so I think when we look at this movement, I think we have to look at it from where you were at the particular time, because different things happen to different people. I oftentimes say that perhaps the most successful piece in the movement to one point was the NAACP, because nothing happens without laws being passed. Now we in CORE and SNCC and other places, we march and we push, but until something becomes a law, you had the lawyers who could go in and get injunctions. You know, that was very, very significant. And I think you're right. I think we don't always recognize the significance of what lawyers did. And I think sometimes what happened here in the district with the fight for statehood is that perhaps it's one of the things that happened in the civil rights movement to a degree that for many of us in the civil rights movement, the movement was about jobs and justice and perhaps education. But somehow it tended to get co-opted to public accommodation became the big thing. That the media or whatever, it sort of took the lead that what we wanted was public accommodation. And that certainly was not. Because in many places, blacks had their little cafes and other things we didn't have. We got secondhand books, so we wanted better education, but it was not always about public education. Jobs, better jobs and education was a priority. And so I think that what happened here in the district is that perhaps residents got comfortable with the federal government being the caretaker and deciding what happened. And so it's always been co-opted because for years, and even today, a lot of people don't understand why we want statehood, you know, in this city. So I think it was part of being co-opted and with the role that the federal government played in the city for a very, very long time before we got where we are now, home rule. Those are just my observations.
Thank you. Wonderful comments. I think we could go on with this conversation all afternoon and probably all week and all month and all year. Unfortunately, we are going to have to wind up, and I'm wondering, that's sort of a good ending place. And Maurice Jackson, you were somebody who really, I think, has done a lot of thinking about Washington and its specificity in the context of the civil rights movement, and maybe you could just wrap up for us with some final thoughts about that.
Well, just a few points, and I do think that Chuck Hicks hit quite a few points. I just know that going from Newport News, Virginia, where black people had stores and everything, and I read Bombingham, there was a school, Carver, I went to Booker T. Washington, then going from there to Groveville, Alabama, it was a different world. You know, King said there's the world, there's America, and there's Mississippi, and I always say he's wrong. It's the world, there's America, and there's Alabama, because I couldn't imagine anything being worse than that. But the difference in life amongst African American people, that's one thing. One other point I would like to say, you know, we can take Dr. King's 63 speech, but I think we have to look at a few other things. If you take Dr. King's speech to clergy and laity concern in 67, where he puts Vietnam on the mission and also on white, on the gender and other things like that. If you take his speech, February 23rd, 1968, The Freedom Ways, where probably no one indicted McCarthyism and indicted the narrow thinking of Americans more than any. And if you take that speech, and then if you take that speech, and then you take the Memphis speech, I think you have a great body. So I think you have to look at the whole collectives of everything. And 63 represents something. It represents a time when we can mobilize people to really look up at certain things. 63 represented, not the beginning, there were many organizations. There's a Southern Negro Youth Council. You very seldom hear about it. There was, and here you had Robeson, Du Bois, and other supporters. So you had many other organizations. But I think here we have an opportunity, especially with young people, and what can be done this summer for 1963. Look, the city is going to have big celebrations, big discussions on 63. Why? The role of Washington, D.C., the role of the March on Washington, what it did in public imagination. And at this point, we have to take what we can get, and we have to use that as a sense of mobilization, but as a sense of theoretical, I think, understanding about this. And it gives, and the role of, you know, Washington, D.C. is unique. Blacks came here for several reasons. They came, many came in the 40s and 50s for GGJ, a good government job. And many came and stayed, and many did have. When I first come to Washington, I can remember blacks not speaking to me. I was just I was a radical walking the street trying to do something, and then I became doctor, and Lord have mercy. But what do I care? As I say, as long as my dog met me at the door, my wife and kids loved me, it didn't matter. But Washington is very much like it, so we just have to take it and move on. You know, to the part, things change. Marion Barry was a great mayor and very supportive of things. Now he doesn't. And when Marion Barry was first elected, he danced with the brides at a gay wedding. I remember it very carefully. Now he's changed. So people change things. We have to move and go where we are now. And the point is that in Washington, D.C., this year, we have a unique opportunity, I think, to educate the world and Washington about what the possibilities are. And lastly, I'd like to say, for those jazz lovers that pick up that CD back there, Charlie Hayden and Hank Jones, it does offer a great view of American music.
Well, thank you all. I want to especially thank Joyce Ladner and Julian Bond for coming, and all of you for coming out on a Sunday, and our great panelists. You know, you're very generous to participate. I hope it's been enlightening. You know, the title of this program is Live to Read. I think here at Politics and Prose, well, we agree totally with that. We would also say you might want to read to live, at least live in a way that allows us all to have this kind of conversation. Please stay afterwards. I'm sure our panelists would be happy to talk to you a little bit more. And thank you very, very much for coming. We so appreciate your participation.